The first time my daughter said I was losing my memory, she said it gently. Her hand rested on my wrist, the way people do when they believe they're softening a difficult truth. We were standing in my kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, late on a Thursday afternoon. I don't remember the exact date anymore, but I remember the light very clearly. Winter light has a certain flatness to it, a pale yellow tone that slips through the window above the sink and makes everything look slightly thinner than it really is. A pot of chicken soup simmered quietly on the stove. The smell of thyme and onion and black pepper filled the room. My grandson Caleb sat at the table with a worksheet spread out in front of him, tapping his pencil against the wood in a steady rhythm that was starting to wear on my nerves. I had asked Melissa about a charge on my checking account. Not accused her, just asked. It was a charge from a medical supply company in Dayton that I didn't recognize. Melissa set her purse on the counter and gave me that careful expression people use when they want to appear patient, kind, even. But there was something else in it too, something a little superior. "Mom," she said softly, "we talked about this. You're forgetting things again." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Not completely. I was 62. I still worked 3 days a week at the Franklin County Records Office. I liked the structure of the work. I've never been someone who does well sitting around a house waiting for the hours to pass. My bills were always paid on time. I drove myself everywhere I needed to go. I kept a small notebook in my purse where every appointment was written in blue ink and every due date in red. Confusion was not something that belonged to my life. I turned off the stove and dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. "I'm not forgetting," I said. "I'm asking what the charge is." Melissa exhaled slowly through her nose and glanced toward Caleb like she wanted him to witness how patient she was being. "It was for the rail in your upstairs bathroom," she said. "David ordered it after you slipped last month." I hadn't slipped. I had missed the last stair while carrying laundry one morning. I caught myself against the wall and bruised my shin. That was the entire incident. It was not the same thing. From the table, Caleb stopped tapping his pencil. Melissa gave a quick laugh, but there wasn't much warmth in it. "Mum, this is exactly what I mean," she said. "You don't remember things the way they happened." The room went quiet after that. Not perfectly quiet. The soup still bubbled softly on the stove. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside on the street. But the kind of quiet that matters had settled into the kitchen. The human kind. The kind where you realize a line has been drawn in the room and everyone present has been asked without words to stand on one side of it. David came in a few minutes later through the back door, carrying a cardboard box from the garage. He had that confident way of entering a room. Some men keep well into their 40s, as though every space belongs to them half a second before they step into it. Melissa told him, lightly, almost joking, that I was upset about the bathroom rail because I didn't remember agreeing to it. David set the box down on the counter and looked at me with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well," he said, "that's why we're trying to help. Trying to help." It was such an ordinary sentence. That was the problem. Some people hide a great deal of control inside language that sounds helpful. I didn't say that out loud then. At the time, it was only a feeling. Something small and cold settling into place somewhere behind my ribs. I served the soup. Caleb barely touched his bowl. Melissa kept glancing at her phone. David took over most of the conversation in that smooth way he had, talking about home maintenance, medication schedules, long-term planning. All very reasonable topics, if you listened only to the words. But the placement of those words felt deliberate. Then he said something that stayed with me. "We should probably start consolidating some things before there's a real issue." I looked up from my bowl. "What things?" "Your accounts," he said. "Bills, maybe the house paperwork, just so nothing falls through the cracks." "My bills are paid." "Of course," he said quickly. "No one's saying otherwise." But that was exactly what he was saying. only wrapped in polite language and delivered with a concerned expression. Melissa reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "Mom, nobody's taking anything from you." That sentence stayed with me because I had never suggested anyone was. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. When people answer accusations you haven't made, it usually means they've been rehearsing them already. After dinner, Caleb asked if he could show me something in the den. He said it casually, but there was a carefulness in his voice children usually don't bother with. We walked down the hallway past the family photos and the umbrella stand and the small table where Melissa kept a ceramic bowl for keys. He stood near the bookshelf and pretended to adjust the zipper on his backpack. Then he looked toward the kitchen to make sure no one was coming. "Grandma," he whispered, "don't say anything yet." Something inside me shifted slightly. He slipped a folded piece of notebook paper into my hand so quickly it almost felt practiced. Children are not naturally subtle, which is why you notice immediately when they try to be. I closed my fingers around the paper and kept my face calm. "What is it, honey?" I asked in a normal voice. His eyes were wide, not childish wide, alert wide. "Just read it later," he whispered. Then, louder, so anyone listening might hear something ordinary, he said, "And that's where I put my science folder." I nodded, as if the sentence made perfect sense. I slipped the note into the pocket of my cardigan. A few minutes later, I put on my coat and said I needed to get home before the roads iced over. I kissed Caleb on the head. Melissa walked me to the front door. "Remember to use the rail once David installs it," she said. "I'll manage," I told her. She gave me a tired look. The kind people sometimes use when they're preparing to describe someone else as difficult later. From inside the house, David called out, "Text us when you get home, okay? Just so we know you made it. Just so we know." Everything sounded reasonable. That was their strength. Nothing, they said, taken individually, would have sounded alarming to an outsider. Concern, planning, safety, responsibility. But I've spent enough years working around county records to understand something important. Order and truth are not always the same thing. I sat in my car for almost a full minute before starting the engine. The folded note was still in my pocket. I could feel the edge of the paper through the wool. I almost opened it there under the porch light. But something inside me said, "Not yet. Go home. Lock the door. Read it where no one can see your face." So I drove back to my house on Eastwood Avenue, with the radio off and both hands on the wheel. It was one of those Ohio nights where everything looks silver around the edges. Bare trees, wet pavement, porch lights reflecting off the street. I passed Street Agnes Church, then the pharmacy, then the laundromat on Livingston that never seemed to close. Ordinary places. Ordinary Thursday. When I got home, I followed the same routine I always follow. I locked the front door, set my purse on the chair in the hallway, took off my shoes, turned on the lamp beside the sofa. Routine has a way of restoring your spine. Then I sat down, reached into my pocket, and unfolded the note. The handwriting was uneven. Pencil pressed hard enough in places to leave small dents in the paper. It said, "Grandma, you are not sick. They are changing papers. Don't tell them I told you." For a moment I simply stared at it. No gasp, no tears, just a very still feeling. That's when everything changed. Not because I understood the whole truth. I didn't. Not because I had proof. I didn't have that either. What I had was something smaller and, in its own way, more serious. A child taking a risk. And I knew enough about the pressure inside families to understand what it costs a child to do that. I read the note again, then a third time. After that, I stood up and walked to the small desk in the front room. I took out my yellow legal pad, the one I use for anything important, and wrote the date at the top of the page. Then I wrote 3 lines. Medical supply charge. Consolidate accounts. Changing papers. I sat there for a moment with the pen still in my hand, listening to the radiator clicking quietly along the wall. I could have called Melissa right then. I could have demanded explanations, started an argument, made everything loud and immediate. Instead, I opened my file drawer and pulled out my bank statements. If someone wanted me to appear confused, the worst thing I could do was perform confusion for them. So I made a decision that night. Not reaction, procedure. I slept lightly that night. Not badly, exactly, just in small pieces. The kind of sleep that comes when your mind has decided to stay half awake, listening for something it doesn't quite understand yet. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up and heard the old furnace start downstairs. The house made that familiar settling sound it always makes in winter, a slow wooden creak that travels through the walls. I remember lying there staring at the ceiling fan, thinking about Caleb's handwriting. "Grandma, you are not sick." Children don't usually choose those words unless they've heard the opposite said many times. By 6:30, I was already sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the stack of bank statements I had pulled from the file cabinet the night before. Morning light came through the east window in a thin stripe across the table. The house felt quiet in that early hour way, where the world hasn't fully begun yet. I opened the first envelope and started reading line by line. That habit came from my work at the county records office. When you spend years reviewing property filings, you stop trusting summaries. Summaries are written by people. Lines are written by systems. The medical supply charge from Dayton appeared exactly where I remembered it. $418.62. But the line underneath it made me pause. A transfer. Small compared to the others, but unfamiliar. $2,000 sent to an account I didn't recognize. I wrote the account number down on the yellow pad. Then I kept reading. Another transfer appeared 2 weeks earlier. $1,500. Different account number. Same routing bank. By the time I finished the page, my coffee had gone cold. That was the first unexplained detail. At the time, I didn't panic. Panic is what people expect when they are trying to guide you toward a conclusion. Instead, I felt something else settling into place. Structure. I wrote the dates carefully beside the amounts and closed the folder. At 8:30, I left for work as usual. The Franklin County Records building sits on High Street, about 3 blocks from the courthouse. It's a square brick structure with narrow windows and long hallways that always smell faintly of old paper and printer toner. Most people only visit when something has gone wrong with a deed or a tax filing. I've always liked the place. Rooms full of records have a certain honesty to them. I spent the morning indexing property filings and scanning a survey map from 1994. Around 11, I walked down the hallway to the copy machine room, where Margaret usually took her early lunch. Margaret had been there longer than I had. She kept peppermint candies in her desk drawer and never signed anything without reading it twice. I leaned against the counter beside the copier. "Can I ask you something procedural?" I said. She adjusted her glasses and looked up. "That's usually where trouble begins," she replied. I handed her my notebook. "If someone were trying to transfer authority over another adult's finances," I asked, "what document would they normally use?" She didn't look surprised. "Power of attorney," she said. "Sometimes guardianship, if they're claiming the person can't manage their affairs." "Incapacity," I said. "That's the word they like." She tapped the notebook lightly with her finger. "Why do you ask?" "At the time, I didn't think much of it," I said, carefully. "My daughter mentioned consolidating some of my accounts. I was just wondering what paperwork that usually involves." Margaret studied my face for a moment longer than usual. "Well," she said slowly, "if someone is trying to claim you can't manage your own finances, there would be filings, petitions, evaluations." She leaned back in her chair. "And those filings would leave a trail." That sentence stayed with me. Evidence actions are easy to imagine when you work in a building full of archives. Pressure is what happens when those archives begin to intersect with your own life. When I left work that afternoon, I didn't drive directly home. Instead, I drove past Melissa's street. Her house sits on a corner lot in Groveport, beige siding with two maple trees in the yard. David's truck was parked in the driveway. I parked a block away and watched the front door. Around 4:15, a man walked up the driveway carrying a clipboard. He rang the doorbell. Melissa opened the door and spoke with him for a moment. Then she signed something. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected. At the time, I couldn't explain why. Later, I understood it mattered more than I realized. I didn't stay there long. Watching too carefully can turn curiosity into suspicion, and suspicion shows on a person's face. Instead, I drove home and made a sandwich I barely tasted. By 7 that evening, the yellow pad was back on my kitchen table. I wrote down 2 words: clipboard visitor, then another: papers. Around 9, my phone rang. Melissa. Her voice sounded gentle in the way voices do when someone has rehearsed sounding calm. Mom, we were thinking maybe we should schedule a memory evaluation for you, she said. Just to establish a baseline, there it was, the humiliation trigger. For a moment, I didn't respond. I watched the ring of condensation slowly spreading from my glass across the wooden table. A baseline, I repeated. Yes, just something simple. Doctors recommend it. Which doctor? There was a brief pause. Dr. Kaplan, she said. David found him. David found him. That was when something shifted again inside my thinking. Not anger, not fear, clarity. All right, I said. You're okay with that? Yes, she sounded relieved. Almost too relieved. We'll schedule it this week, she said. After we hung up, I sat there looking at the kitchen window for a long moment. The clipboard man, the unfamiliar accounts, Caleb's note, and Margaret's sentence. Those filings would leave a trail. The next morning, instead of going straight to my desk at the records office, I walked into the public access room. Most people don't realize how much information sits quietly inside those computer terminals. Property filings, civil petitions, guardianship requests. I typed my name into the search bar. Nothing appeared. That wasn't surprising. These things take time. Then I searched the civil docket under Melissa's last name. Something appeared. A draft petition filed 2 days earlier, incomplete, not yet processed, but unmistakable. Petition for financial guardianship, filed by Melissa Harper and David Harper. Respondent, Elaine Harper, me. For a moment, the room felt unusually still. People were still typing around me. A printer hummed near the door. But inside my head, something settled into place. That's when the room went quiet. Authority has a shape when you see it written on paper. And that shape had my daughter's signature at the bottom. I printed the document, saved the file onto a flash drive. Then I closed the terminal and returned to my desk. 2 evidence actions. Print, save. After that came the pressure. At 12:40, my phone buzzed. A text message from Caleb. 3 words. He knows now. I didn't answer Caleb's message right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because children sometimes send a sentence before they fully understand what it means. Acting too quickly might have confirmed that he had spoken to me. So I did what procedure usually requires. I waited. Around 1:30, the building had that familiar after-lunch quiet. A few co-workers returned to their offices, and the hallway noise faded to the soft hum of printers and distant keyboards. Margaret walked past my desk, carrying a stack of folders, and slowed when she saw the printed petition lying beside my keyboard. That didn't take long, she said. I slid the document toward her. She read it slowly. Margaret always reads slowly. That's one of the reasons I trust her. When she finished, she looked up over her glasses. They're moving faster than I expected. I nodded. What happens next? I asked. She tapped the paper with the end of her pen. Next comes the evaluation. A physician writes a recommendation. Then the court reviews it. If the judge believes you can't manage your own affairs, they appoint the petitioner. The petitioner being my daughter. Yes. And if the evaluation says otherwise, then the petition collapses. She leaned back slightly in her chair. Most people don't realize guardianship cases hinge on that one document. I thought about Melissa's phone call the night before, the baseline evaluation. The word baseline had sounded harmless when she said it. But in legal language, baseline often means something different. It means the starting point of a conclusion someone has already decided to reach. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. Because that was when I stopped thinking about the situation as a family disagreement and started thinking about it as a file. Files have structure, and structure leaves openings. Around 3 that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Caleb. Mom said we're seeing the doctor Thursday. Thursday. Just under 2 days away. I typed back carefully. Okay. Thank you for telling me. The reply came almost immediately. Don't tell them I said anything. I answered. I won't. Then I turned the phone face down on the desk. Evidence actions sometimes need pauses between them. Otherwise, the story begins to move too fast for people to keep up. When I got home that evening, the house still carried the faint scent of lemon cleaner from the counters I had wiped that morning. It's funny how ordinary details become clearer when something important is unfolding around them. I set my purse on the chair near the door and turned on the kitchen light. Then I sat down at the table with the printed petition. The document wasn't finished yet. The last page, where the physician's recommendation would eventually appear, was still blank. But the language of the petition itself had already been written. It described me as experiencing progressive memory decline. It mentioned financial confusion. And it stated that transferring financial authority to Melissa would provide responsible oversight. Responsible oversight. The phrase sat on the page with quiet confidence. Some people mistake silence for permission. I wrote that sentence across the top of my yellow pad, not because I intended to say it to Melissa, but because it captured the mistake I believed David was making. That evening I made tea and sat in the living room with the documents spread out beside me. Around 8:15 the phone rang again. David this time. Hey Elaine, he said. Melissa told me you're fine with the evaluation Thursday. I said I would attend. Great. It's routine. Routine. Of course, I said. There was a short pause. Then he added, almost casually, afterward, we can review your accounts and simplify a few things. Simplify. I watched the steam from the teacup drift upward in the lamplight. That sounds efficient, I said. He seemed satisfied with that answer. We ended the call a few seconds later. Pressure rarely arrives as shouting. More often it arrives as confidence. Wednesday morning I took a personal day from the records office. Instead of driving downtown, I drove to the courthouse annex where the probate clerk works. The building sits just behind the main courthouse, an older structure with marble floors that echo softly when people walk through the halls. I signed in at the front counter and asked to review a guardianship petition. The clerk, a young man with a careful voice, pulled the file from a tray behind the desk. You're the respondent? He asked. Yes. He slid the folder toward me. Since the petition hasn't been processed yet, you're free to review it. I took a seat at a small table near the window and read through every page again. Filed by Melissa Harper and David Harper. Grounds, cognitive decline, recommendation pending. Everything looked neat, organized, professional. But something about the filing time caught my attention. Tuesday morning, 2 days earlier, which meant the paperwork had already been prepared before Melissa called to schedule the evaluation. That realization arrived quietly. the evaluation wasn't the beginning. It was confirmation. I exported a copy of the petition to my flash drive, printed a certified record request. Then I thanked the clerk and stepped outside. 2 evidence actions: export, print. The pressure arrived 20 minutes later. My phone buzzed while I was sitting in the car. Melissa. "Mom, where are you?" she asked. "Out running errands. I stopped by the house earlier. You weren't there." I hadn't told her I'd taken the day off. "Oh," she said after a moment. "Well, David and I just want to make sure you're okay. I appreciate that. Thursday should clarify things." "Clarify?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I think it will." That night I looked again at Caleb's note. "Grandma, you are not sick. They are changing papers." The second line stayed with me longer than the first. Changing papers. That phrase doesn't come from a 7-year-old imagination. It comes from hearing adults speak when they believe children aren't listening. At 10:30, I folded the note again and placed it back into my cardigan pocket. Because the next morning was Thursday, and Thursday was the day the doctor would decide whether my life remained mine or became a document someone else signed. Thursday morning arrived colder than the rest of the week. Ohio winters have a way of doing that. The air feels thin when you step outside, and every sound seems to travel farther than it should. A light frost covered my driveway when I backed the car out of the garage a little after 8. Melissa had scheduled the appointment for 9:30. The clinic sat in a small medical complex off Hamilton Road, a group of beige buildings connected by sidewalks and neatly trimmed hedges that looked almost artificial in the winter light. I parked near the far edge of the lot and sat in the car for a moment before turning off the engine. At the time, I wouldn't say I felt nervous. It was closer to the feeling you get before a formal meeting where most of the decisions have already been drafted somewhere else. I stepped out of the car and walked into the building at 9:22. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and the burnt coffee from a machine in the corner. A television mounted on the wall played a morning news program with the volume low enough that you could hear the receptionist's keyboard tapping over it. Melissa and David were already there. Melissa stood when she saw me and gave me a careful smile, the kind people use when they believe cooperation has already been secured. "Mom," she said warmly. David nodded from his chair. "Elaine." They had chosen seats facing the hallway that led to the exam rooms. Strategic seating, I suppose. I signed my name on the clipboard at the front desk. "Elaine Harper." The receptionist handed me another sheet. "Just a few intake questions," she said. Most of them were routine. Date of birth, current medications, emergency contact. I filled them out slowly. Halfway down the page, there was a section labeled Cognitive Concerns. 3 boxes appeared beneath it: memory decline, financial confusion, behavioral instability. None of them were checked. I handed the form back. Melissa watched the exchange from across the room. "That's interesting," she said lightly. "I thought the office would have pre-filled some of that." The receptionist looked slightly confused. "We usually let the physician determine those things during the evaluation." The room cooled a little after that. Authority often does that. At 9:38, a nurse appeared at the hallway door. "Elaine Harper?" I stood. Melissa began to stand as well, but the nurse lifted her hand gently. "The physician will see Miss Harper alone first." Melissa slowly sat back down. That was the first procedural shift of the morning. The exam room was small and bright. A framed photograph of a lake hung above the sink, and the clock on the wall ticked loudly enough to notice. Dr. Kaplan sat behind a desk, reviewing something on a tablet. He looked younger than I expected. Early 40s, perhaps. He greeted me politely and motioned to the chair across from him. "Your daughter scheduled an evaluation," he said. "Yes." He tapped the screen once. "I'd like to ask you a few questions first. The evaluation itself was almost ordinary. What year is it? Who is the current president? Subtract 7 from 100. Name 3 objects and repeat them later." I answered each one without difficulty. At one point, he handed me a sheet of paper and asked me to draw a clock. I drew the circle, added the numbers, placed the hands. 9:45, the same time shown on the clock above his desk. He looked at the drawing, then back at me. Do you feel you've been experiencing memory problems? No. He studied me quietly for a moment. Why do you believe your daughter requested this evaluation? For a second, I considered several answers. I could have said misunderstanding, concern, family confusion. Instead, I said something simpler. I believe my daughter intends to petition the court for financial guardianship. His eyebrows lifted slightly. That's a specific conclusion. I reviewed the filing yesterday. There was a brief pause. Then he nodded once and typed something into the tablet. That was the moment the temperature in the room shifted again. Procedure has a way of clarifying things faster than emotion. Doctor. Kaplan closed the tablet and leaned back slightly in his chair. Miss Harper, he said calmly, nothing in this evaluation suggests cognitive impairment. The sentence arrived without emphasis. But it carried weight. The results will be documented, he continued. If a guardianship petition has been filed, the court will review the physician's report. I nodded. Thank you. Before standing, I added one more sentence. My daughter and son-in-law are waiting outside. Yes. They may expect the evaluation to support their petition. Doctor. Kaplan's expression remained neutral. My responsibility is to the evaluation. That sentence mattered. Authority doesn't bend for performance. When we stepped back into the waiting room, Melissa stood again. How did it go? She asked quickly. Dr. Kaplan answered before I could. The evaluation is complete. David leaned forward slightly in his chair. And? The results will be included in the physician's report submitted to the court. Melissa's confidence wavered. But, did you notice any issues? Doctor. Kaplan paused. The report will explain the findings. That's when the room went quiet again. Melissa glanced at David. David looked back at her. For the first time since the conversation in the kitchen earlier that week, their confidence flickered. Small, but visible. We left the clinic a few minutes later. Melissa insisted on walking me to my car. Mom, she said carefully, sometimes these tests don't catch early symptoms. I'm sure the report will explain the results. She nodded slowly. David stood near the entrance watching us. On the drive home, I thought about the evaluation, about the petition, about Caleb's note. The first part of the system had responded. But systems move slowly, and people who believe they are entitled to something rarely stop after the first obstacle. Around 4 that afternoon, my phone buzzed. A notification from my bank. A transfer request had been submitted from my account. That was the moment the escalation began. The bank notification arrived at 4:12 inches the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing out a coffee mug, when my phone vibrated against the countertop. The sound echoed through the room a little louder than usual. Transfer request submitted. Amount, $8,000. Destination account, unfamiliar. For a moment, I didn't move. I set the mug carefully in the drying rack and wiped my hands on the towel beside the stove before picking up the phone. The alert came from the banking notification system I had set up years earlier, after a coworker once told me it had helped her catch a fraudulent charge. At the time, I hadn't thought much about that precaution. Later, I realized it mattered more than I understood. I opened the banking app and read the transfer request again. The account number looked familiar. Not identical to the ones I had written on the yellow pad earlier in the week, but close enough to catch my attention. Different digits. Same routing bank. Financial lane. I took a screenshot of the transaction details. Evidence. Action 1. Then I saved the information to the notes file on my phone. Evidence. Action 2. After that, I stopped. Evidence without pressure can remain invisible. So I called the bank. The hold music was the same gentle instrumental loop they've used for years. A young man answered after about 40 seconds. Fraud department, this is Kevin. I gave him my name and asked him to review the transfer request attached to my account. He confirmed the amount. Then he asked a question that shifted the temperature again. Did you authorize someone else to access your account? No. I could hear him typing. I'm placing a temporary hold on the transaction, he said. You'll need to come into the branch and verify your identification so we can secure the account. Thank you, I said. We'll flag the login as suspicious activity until we confirm the user. When the call ended, I wrote 2 more lines on the yellow pad. Transfer blocked. Bank meeting. Pressure beat. At 5:03 that evening, my phone rang again. Melissa. Her voice sounded tighter than usual. Mom, did you cancel the transfer? Yes. You shouldn't be interfering with those adjustments. Adjustments. That money was for property taxes, she said quickly. On which property? I asked. There was a short pause. You know what I mean. No, I said calmly. I don't. The silence between us stretched longer than before. Finally, she said, David and I are just trying to keep things organized. That's thoughtful. She exhaled sharply. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I imagine that's frustrating. The call ended a few seconds later. When I placed the phone back on the table, I noticed something about the conversation. For the first time, she sounded uncertain. Not angry, uncertain. Financial pressure had begun. The next morning, I drove to the bank branch on Broad Street. The building sits between a pharmacy and a small insurance office. Inside, it smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and printer ink. Kevin met me in a small office behind the teller counters. He turned his computer monitor toward me. There have been 3 transfer attempts this week, he said. 3. The earlier ones had been smaller. $2,000, $1,000, $500. Exactly the numbers I had written on my yellow pad. Evidence loop resolved. He explained that the transfer requests had been submitted through an external login connected to my account credentials. Do you share your password with anyone? He asked. No. Has anyone helped you log into your banking recently? I thought about Melissa sitting at my kitchen table 2 weeks earlier. Backstory scene. Physical action. She slid my laptop across the table. Sensory detail. The faint citrus scent of her hand lotion. Dialogue. Just log in here, Mum. It'll make bill pay easier. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Now I understood the access point. Kevin printed the account activity report. Evidence Action 1. Then he saved the file to the bank's compliance archive. Evidence Action 2. After that came the pressure. Based on these attempts, he said, We're placing a security lock on the account until authorized users are confirmed. Good. You should also change your credentials. I planned. 2. When I stepped outside the bank, the winter air felt colder than it had that morning. Financial lane tightening. But pressure rarely stays financial for long. By noon, the social lane appeared. I stopped at the grocery store on Livingston Avenue on the way home. Mrs. Ortega, who lives 2 houses down from me, stood in the produce aisle studying a pile of oranges. She smiled when she saw me. Elaine, I heard you might be moving. I blinked once. Moving? Yes, she said gently. Melissa mentioned you might be going somewhere with more supervision. Social lane, rumor. I'm not moving, I said. Oh. She looked honestly surprised. Well, that's good to hear. I placed a bag of apples in my cart and continued down the aisle. Pressure doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as community assumptions. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived from the probate clerk. Official envelope. Inside was the formal notice, confirming that the guardianship petition had been accepted for review. Court date scheduled. 3 weeks. Institutional lane tightening. I placed the letter on the table beside Caleb's note, paper beside paper, evidence beside truth. That evening, while I was washing dishes, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Caleb. 3 words. Dad is mad. I dried my hands slowly on the dish towel. Children notice pressure faster than adults believe they do. I wrote back a single sentence. You did the right thing. The next morning, David appeared at my front door without calling first. Social lane escalation. He stood on the porch with his hands in the pockets of his jacket. We need to talk, he said. I opened the door but didn't step aside yet. Yes? You're complicating things. How so? The court is already reviewing your situation. You could make this easier for everyone. I watched him quietly for a moment. Then I said something that surprised him. I agree. He blinked. You do? Yes. I stepped back and opened the door wider. Because escalation sometimes requires visibility, and visibility often makes people talk. David stepped into the house slowly, the way someone does when they're not entirely certain what kind of conversation they're about to have. The front hallway still carried the faint scent of lemon cleaner from earlier in the week. My coat hung on the rack beside the door, and the small table under the mirror held the usual things: mail, my keys, and the ceramic dish Gloria had given me years ago before she passed. He glanced around briefly, as if measuring the room. Coffee? I asked. He hesitated for a second. Sure. I led him into the kitchen. There's something about kitchen tables that changes the tone of a conversation. Offices feel official, living rooms feel social, but kitchens are where people end up saying things they didn't intend to say. I poured 2 cups and placed one in front of him. He didn't touch it. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice. Elaine, he said, Melissa and I are trying to help you. But when you start freezing bank transfers and questioning paperwork, it complicates the process. Process. I sat down across from him. What process would that be? The guardianship process. There it was, not implied, not softened, said plainly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, a car rolled slowly down Eastwood Avenue. The radiator near the window gave its usual soft clicking sound as the heat moved through the pipes. Inside the kitchen, David realized something. He had just said the quiet part out loud. People often reveal more than they intend when they begin explaining procedure. You've already filed the petition, I said. Yes. And the evaluation? We'll see what the doctor says. He already said it. David frowned slightly. What? That there is no impairment. For the first time that morning, his composure slipped. Just a little. That's not final, he said quickly. Doctors miss early symptoms. I took a small sip of coffee. Possibly. He leaned back in the chair. Look, Elaine, we're not trying to take anything from you. The same sentence again. Repeated language is interesting. When people say the same reassurance more than once, it often means they're trying to convince themselves. What exactly do you believe guardianship would give you? I asked. Control over the accounts, he said. Property management. Medical decisions if necessary. So, my entire life. Well, technically, that word lingered in the air. Technically. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. Because that was the moment David stopped performing concern and started explaining authority. And explanations create evidence. A minute passed before he spoke again. You should think about how this looks in court, he said. Refusing help doesn't strengthen your position. Neither does unauthorized bank access. He blinked. The bank contacted you? Yes. There was another quiet pause. Then his posture changed slightly. The confidence that had carried him through the first half of the conversation began to thin. Panic hadn't arrived yet. But the space between them had opened. Institutional tightening had begun. At 1:20 that afternoon, my phone rang. Kevin from the bank. Miss Harper, he said. Our compliance department reviewed the login activity on your account. Yes. The access attempts came from a device registered under another user profile. Which profile? Melissa Harper. Financial lane tightening. Evidence loop resolved. Kevin continued. We've placed a formal security lock on the account pending investigation. Thank you. Our compliance department may also provide documentation to the probate court, if requested. That may become relevant. When I ended the call, David was still sitting across the table. He had heard enough to understand where the situation was moving. The bank is overreacting, he said quickly. Banks usually prefer caution. This will make the court think you're paranoid. That's one interpretation. His jaw tightened. Elaine, you're making a mistake. No, I said quietly. I'm documenting one. The sentence landed harder than I expected. He pushed his chair back slightly. You don't understand how this works. You're probably right, I said calmly. But the court will. That was the moment the temperature in the room changed. Not because anyone raised their voice, not because anyone made threats. But because David finally understood something. Authority doesn't come from saying something first. It comes from the record that exists when the conversation ends. He looked at me for several seconds. Then he said, Melissa won't stop. I wouldn't expect her to. You're going to turn this into a legal fight. I shook my head slightly. It already is. He stood a moment later and walked toward the front door. The conversation was over. The door closed behind him with a quiet click. For a while, I remained sitting at the kitchen table. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, the sky had turned that pale winter-grey Ohio afternoons settle into when the sun disappears behind cloud cover. At 4:30, another letter arrived. This one from the probate court, a confirmation notice. The physician's evaluation had been received and entered into the case file. I read the sentence twice. Entered into the case file. Institutional lane tightening, pressure shifting. The next move would no longer come from Melissa or David. It would come from the court. That evening, just before 9, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Caleb. 3 words. Mom is scared. When Caleb wrote Mom is scared, I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't care. Quite the opposite. Children often describe adult emotions with surprising precision. They may not understand the full context, but they notice tone, posture, and silence in ways adults sometimes forget. I read the message again and placed the phone gently on the kitchen table beside my notebook. Outside the window, a light snow had begun to fall. Not enough to cover the ground, yet just small flakes drifting sideways through the porch light. Fear changes the rhythm of a situation. Confidence moves forward. Fear begins searching for exits. I wrote one more line on the yellow pad. Tone shift, fear. Then I closed the notebook and went to bed. The next morning, at 8:07, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Franklin County Probate Court. A woman introduced herself as Miss Alvarez, the clerk assigned to preliminary guardianship reviews. Her voice had the calm neutrality of someone accustomed to speaking about serious matters without adding emotion to them. Miss Harper, she said, I'm calling to confirm that you received notice of the guardianship petition filed by Melissa Harper and David Harper. Yes, I did. I also want to confirm that the physician's evaluation has now been submitted to the case file. I was notified yesterday. There was a brief pause while she reviewed something on her end. Then she said something that cooled the situation even further. The physician's report indicates no cognitive impairment. I let the sentence settle. Yes. In that case, she continued, the court will likely move toward dismissal unless additional evidence is presented. Dismissal. Certain words change the temperature of a situation immediately. Pressure moves through families faster than paperwork ever does. I understand, I said. You will still be required to attend the preliminary hearing next week, she added. But the physician's report significantly affects the petition. Thank you for letting me know. We ended the call. I placed the phone on the table and sat quietly for a moment. The house felt unusually still, but it was a different kind of quiet than earlier in the week. Earlier, the quiet had felt uncertain. Now it felt procedural. Around 10:30 that morning, the social lane shifted again. There was a knock on the front door. Mrs. Ortega stood on the porch holding a small bag of oranges. I heard things may have gotten sorted out, she said gently. News travels quickly in neighborhoods like ours. Not always accurately, but quickly. We're working through it, I said. She nodded. Well, I always thought you seemed perfectly capable to me. Sometimes, people outside a situation notice what the people inside it overlook. After she left, I returned to the kitchen table and reviewed the documents again. The petition, the bank activity report, the physician's evaluation. Each piece now fit into place. Procedure had begun doing its work, but pressure rarely disappears immediately. At 2:14 that afternoon, my phone rang again. Melissa. Her voice sounded noticeably different this time. Measured, careful. Mom, she said. We should talk. I'm listening. The court clerk called David this morning. I imagine they did. A longer pause followed. We may need to reconsider the petition, she said. Reconsider. Another interesting word. That's your decision, I replied. We only wanted to make sure everything was handled responsibly. Yes, you understand that, right? At the time, I noticed something important about the conversation. Melissa was no longer trying to persuade me. She was repositioning herself for the court. People often do that when the record stops supporting their version of events. We'll discuss it at the hearing, I said. After we hung up, I wrote the time down. 2:18 p.m. Documentation habits don't disappear once you start them. That evening, Caleb sent another message. Just one line. Dad said court might cancel. I replied, sometimes paperwork answers faster than people do. Outside, the snow had begun to settle on the yard, white across the grass. Quiet. Later that night, while making tea, I found myself thinking again about the sentence I had written earlier in the week. Some people mistake silence for permission. That had been David's mistake. Not cruelty, not anger. Assumption. The assumption that a quiet person would remain quiet once the paperwork began moving. The hearing would still happen the following week, but by now the structure of the outcome had already begun to show itself. And once structures become visible, they rarely reverse direction. The hearing was scheduled for the following Wednesday morning. Franklin County Probate Court occupies an older section of the courthouse, the kind of place where the ceilings are a little higher than modern buildings, and footsteps echo softly along the marble floors. I arrived about 20 minutes early. That has always been my habit. Arriving early allows you to observe a room before the room begins observing you. The waiting area outside courtroom B had 6 chairs along one wall and a long wooden bench opposite them. A few other people were already there for unrelated matters. 2 men speaking quietly about a property dispute, and an older couple holding a stack of papers between them like something fragile. Melissa and David arrived about 5 minutes after I did. They didn't sit beside me. Melissa gave me a small nod of acknowledgement, but neither of them attempted conversation. Their posture was different now, less confident than before. Not frightened exactly, but more aware. Pressure changes the way people occupy space. At 9:02, the courtroom door opened, and a clerk stepped into the hallway. Harper guardianship petition. We all stood and walked inside. The courtroom itself was modest in size. A judge's bench at the front, 2 tables for the parties involved, and a short row of seats behind them. The room carried the quiet weight that legal spaces often have the sense that conversations here become records. A moment later, the judge entered and took her seat. Guardianship hearings are not dramatic affairs. They are procedural. The clerk summarized the petition first. Filed by Melissa Harper and David Harper, requesting financial guardianship over Elaine Harper. Then she read the physician's evaluation. No cognitive impairment observed. Patient demonstrates full financial comprehension and independent decision-making capacity. That's when the room went quiet again. Not the tense quiet from earlier moments in the story. A procedural quiet, the kind that appears when a conclusion has already begun to form. The judge reviewed the file in front of her for several seconds before speaking. "Miss Harper," she said, looking toward Melissa, "can you explain why this petition was filed, despite the absence of supporting medical evidence?" Melissa shifted slightly in her chair. "We were concerned about my mother's well-being," she said. "And the financial activity referenced in the report?" the judge asked. Melissa glanced briefly toward David. "We believed assistance was necessary." The judge nodded once and turned another page in the file. "Assistance," she said calmly, "is not the same as incapacity." She paused. "Guardianship is an extraordinary intervention. It requires clear evidence that an adult cannot manage their own affairs." Her tone remained steady, almost gentle. "Based on the physician's evaluation and the information provided by the financial institution, the court finds no such evidence." Then she said the sentence that had begun forming the moment the physician's report entered the record. "The petition is dismissed." Just like that. No raised voices, no dramatic arguments. Procedure had reached its conclusion. Melissa sat very still beside David. For a moment I thought she might say something more, but she didn't. Sometimes silence is the clearest acknowledgement that remains. The judge looked briefly in my direction. "Miss Harper, no further action is required on your part." "Thank you," I said. We left the courtroom a few minutes later. The hallway outside felt brighter than it had earlier that morning. Sunlight had reached the tall courthouse windows by then, reflecting softly across the marble floor. Melissa stopped a few steps behind me. "Mom," she said quietly. I turned. Her voice no longer carried the certainty it had in the kitchen weeks earlier. "We were only trying to help." I considered that sentence for a moment. At the time, I didn't feel anger, just clarity. "Help," I said gently, "usually begins with a conversation." She nodded slowly but didn't respond. David remained beside her, silent. We walked out of the courthouse together, but separated once we reached the parking lot. No confrontation, no raised voices, just distance. Later that afternoon, I drove past Melissa's house on my way home. Caleb was outside in the yard with a soccer ball, lightly kicking it against the garage door. When he saw my car, he waved. I slowed and rolled the window down. "It worked," he said quietly. "Yes," I said. "You're not sick?" "No." He nodded with the straightforward relief children rarely bother to hide. Then he said something that stayed with me. "I knew you weren't." I drove home after that. The house looked exactly the same as it had the week before. The same lamp beside the sofa. The same radiator clicking softly along the wall. The same quiet evening settling over Eastwood Avenue. But the feeling inside the quiet had changed. Earlier in the story, silence had been mistaken for permission. Now it had returned to what it had always been meant to be: choice. A few days later, the court mailed the final dismissal notice. I placed it in the same drawer where I keep my bank statements and property documents. Records belong together. Before closing the drawer, I looked once more at Caleb's note. "Grandma, you are not sick. They are changing papers." Some truths arrive through complicated investigations. Others arrive folded in pencil on a small piece of notebook paper. And sometimes that is enough. If stories about quiet boundaries resonate with you, you're welcome to stay.